India and China have been held responsible for contributing to a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. What are your comments on that?
Well, I think it's true that the growth in global greenhouse gas emissions is going to come from countries like China and India. But I don't think it's right for countries like America, which have been the source of the greenhouse gas emissions in the world to date, to point the finger at India and say that they must move first on this issue. Every country in the world obviously has to play its role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, because that is truly a global problem. But the developed world has to lead the way, because 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere today are from the developed world. We need to find an equitable solution that enables the growth in countries like India and China while we address that issue.
How do you suggest striking a balance between the current real estate growth and environment sustainability?
Well, I think there's two ways to look at the move to green buildings and green real estate. Some people think that it's a cost imposition and it stands in the way of generating prosperity. The way I see it, and many others see it, is it's actually a source of prosperity. An efficient building reduces your costs, enabling greater wealth creation. And when you look at the pain that is occurring in nations such as India and many around the world with high oil prices and our dependence on oil, I think it's important to enable continuing growth in countries such as this, that we wean ourselves off the same dependence that we have on energy.
In what way would innovation help in sustainability?
Well, with regards to innovation and sustainability, there is no standard solution to a green building, because every building is different. It's occupied by different people, it's owned by different people, it has different financial structures, different systems in the building, different facades, different climatic conditions. There's many factors that make it different. So there is no standard solution to a green building. The only way to achieve green buildings is to identify what is appropriate in a specific context, and that takes creative thinking, innovative thinking. And so at Colliers International, that's something we're nurturing. We're ensuring our people understand that there is no standard solution, and we're nurturing a culture of innovation around green buildings to help find solutions for our clients which generate the most value for them and the most environmental benefit.
Would similar solutions apply to all the countries?
There will be factors of green buildings that are applicable in both India and the Gulf, as per your example. But India, for example, has a specific culture, and within India there's many specific cultures. There's many different climates in India. There's many different types of building practices, regulation, planning constraints. So even within India, even within the state that we're in today, a green building practice here may not be appropriate in other places. And so we need to find what is appropriate here, and that might be very different to other locations.
To what extent do the sustainable buildings depend on local raw material?
Well, that's a good question. And it's interesting when you look at the history of green buildings, it's actually not new. It's only a new brand. If you look in the history of India, as per many countries in the world, the historical vernacular architecture was inherently green because it was born out of what was available in that location, the skills of people, the raw materials that were there. It's only in recent decades have we gone astray with global technologies that in many cases have been inappropriately applied in specific locations. So one of the big tricks to green buildings is to look back in history and see what has worked over hundreds of thousands of years and interpret that in a modern way.
Simon also shares his views on Taj Mahal.
Well, not only is it, in my mind, one of the most beautiful, if not the most beautiful building in the world, I think, first of all, good architecture or great architecture stands the test of time. And it's an important principle of sustainability. We can use all of the green buildings and apply energy efficient technology, but if we're not producing buildings that generate value for human beings, that uplift the spirit, that inherently is not sustainable. It's an important attribute, and the Taj Mahal certainly uplifts the spirit, and within it there's some fundamental thermal and passive ventilation strategies which are standing the test of time. We don't need to air condition that building, for example.
Which, according to you, is the most sustainable city in the world?
A city that I would love to visit one day is Curitiba in Brazil. And that was a city that had had a lot of poverty. It was not a great city to live in. And a decade or so ago, a new mayor called Jamie Lerner, who was an architect, applied a designer's thinking to that city, and he's revolutionised it. It's got a terrific low-cost public transport system which has activated the city, and poor people who recycle materials helping clean up the city receive coupons to travel on that public transport system. So it's making it more sustainable in many ways. It's a very smart piece of urban design and urban renewal.
Could you elaborate on managing risks associated with environment sustainability?
Well, for stakeholders in property, there's a number of risks, but there's also a number of opportunities. I think when you step back and you look at what is happening in the world, the radical shift in politics, the work that economists are doing to work out where we can find deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions quickly, and the understanding that the built environment is attributable for a large amount of those greenhouse gas emissions, it's clear that a lot of activity is going to be focused on the built environment. And so there's some strong regulatory risks. There's also risks to do with climate change itself. You know, if we are experiencing more typhoons or greater heat waves, will our buildings be able to cope with that? There's risks to do with demand. We're seeing around the world corporations demanding greener buildings to manage their reputation, to be able to attract and retain talented employees for a number of reasons. And so if landlords and developers are not able to supply appropriate buildings for those demands, that's a risk. But on the flip side, there's some tremendous opportunities. A developer or a landlord, and there's clearly many in India who are smart in this way, who use green buildings, who use green building practices, are able to differentiate themselves in their markets. And green buildings can be a hallmark of quality. There's a number of attributes associated with them. It also means they're future-proofing their assets. As changes occur in markets, as regulation occurs, as there's new demands placed on their buildings, they're better positioned than their competitors. We call that future-proofing.
Which countries would be the most affected by climate change?
The countries that will suffer the most are those with low-lying areas, and certainly some of the big estuary areas. Bangladesh is an area of real concern. And if sea levels rise by 6 metres, I understand an area of Bangladesh will be flooded. That affects over 50 million people. I hope that doesn't happen soon, but who knows? It's very hard for the scientists to predict.
Would developing countries also face the wrath of climate change?
Well, I'm really fearful for the developing countries because I think the most suffering in the world will occur there. But it's not to say that it won't occur in the developed world. You only have to think back to how poorly America was able to respond to the destruction of New Orleans with Katrina. They did not handle that one disaster very well at all.
How do you think government intervention could be of help in this domain?
I think that's important because, as I said, in any market there will be laggards. People who simply refuse to change even though those around them are changing. So there should be some regulation to support that part of the market.
What's the approximate cost of constructing green buildings?
Well, focusing on the construction cost, green buildings can be more expensive. But the really important thing to remember is that they can also be cheaper. Of course, people want to understand the cost of producing a green building, but as we've discussed already, one green building can be very different to another green building. It's a very loose term that we use. but it's what is appropriate in a specific context. And so we're seeing some developers pay more for their green buildings, but others actually save costs. So you have to be very careful talking about average costs for green buildings, because that excludes the possibility for the smart developers to actually save construction costs. And what happens with those who really take on the challenge and are prepared to learn, are prepared to employ the principles early in their process and use good consultants, often this is a catalyst for them to innovate and to find savings in other parts of their construction and development processes that they might not have otherwise found.
What is your opinion on Indian buildings being stylized the Western way?
Well, I think this is a case in point. That's not a sustainable practice, because it's not design that is rooted in the local context and what is appropriate there. And it's those designs that are going to come back to haunt us in later days. It's like the energy inefficient cars that we have on the roads. I read the other day in an Indian newspaper about General Motors suggesting they might try and sell their Hummer business. And the suggestion is they should have done it 3 years ago, because now with the price of fuel, it's not worth that much. The same may occur for many buildings that are being produced in the way you described.
What's your opinion on sustainability?
I think we need to be aware of the rate of change that we're going to experience in coming years. There's always that wonderful example of the frog in the boiling water. The frog that hops in the boiling water knows to jump straight out, but when you put the frog in the cold water and slowly turns up the heat, it cooks. You should really save the frog. But that's kind of how humans behave, and it's how we've behaved with regards to crises such as climate change. It's been emerging slowly. CO2 is colourless, odourless, tasteless, and it's been transforming our world to our collective detriment. But what is happening around the world is there is a recognition that this is a crisis. We're seeing an acceleration in response to that. You only have to look at what is happening in America right now. If Barack Obama is elected president, his target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by the year 2050 is an 80% reduction. And even John McCain has a reduction of 65%. That is nothing short of a revolution in our economies. And the focus will be on green buildings and certainly real estate practices. So it's a really exciting time for real estate professionals such as Colliers International, because we realise we can play an enormous role, but we're also cautious to be prepared for the change and advise everybody involved in the built environment and real estate to keep an eye on this, because those who help lead the change will also be able to enjoy the benefits. The carbon economy, after all, is going to be worth many, many trillions of dollars. Those who follow the change will suffer.